Hello, YouTube. Hopefully, this is the last video I have to make on this topic. Not only because I really hope DE does what I will suggest as, I think, the best solution to this problem, but also provide sort of a comprehensive overview and explanation on the problems that Excalibur Prime has created that have always existed in the game, that the addition of Excalibur Umbra didn't fix and still doesn't fix. And I think the best way to do that is to just rattle off what those problems are. So, we talk about the three versions of Excalibur. You've got base Excalibur, you've got Excalibur Prime, and then you got Excalibur Umbra. Excalibur Prime, one of the problems he creates, is that he has higher base stats than Excalibur. Now, this is obvious. This is the case with every single non-prime and prime variation. But I think that's a problem. And that's because for the second major issue, which is that for you to solve that problem of base stat differences, you have to go to Umbra, who has the same base stats as Excalibur Prime. But then you run into a major issue, being the issues that still exist, bugs, literally game-breaking bugs, that exist with Excalibur Umbra's Sentience passive. So then if you want to disable that passive, you have to use Warrior's Rest, which then creates a gap between the builds that can be run on Excalibur Prime and Excalibur Umbra that you can't always fix by going to base Excalibur, especially now with an arcane like Arcane Persistence, because base stat differences exist between those frames. And then lastly, and this is a problem across the board that is unique to Excalibur, which is that the best version of that Warframe, whether that's Prime or Umbra, has a very limited acquisition to it. As in, even if you're a founder, you've got one Excalibur Prime, you've got one Excalibur Umbra, and then potentially infinite copies of base Excalibur. That's a unique issue to Excalibur because you think once a Warframe comes out, you can get infinite versions of that. Theoretically infinite versions of that. And then when the Prime comes out, you can also get infinite versions of that. Theoretical infinite versions of that. Which is, for those of us that spend a lot of time build crafting and want build variety, is a genuine issue. So even just take the difference here. Between Prime, I have a completely different build setup. I'm not using persistence on him because I don't have umbral polarities to be able to fully run the builds that I want to run. Like, here's an example. Can't fully run the build that I want to run because I need 2, if not 3, umbral polarities to be able to do that. So then I can go on to Umbra, and yeah, I can do this here, where I have more than just one umbral polarity on him. But then you run into the limitation of having to run Warrior's Rest to prevent sometimes your subsumes from breaking, and if you don't also run this, you can run into the game-breaking bug of having half of your abilities permanently disabled for the rest of the mission, or nullified is probably the most accurate in-game way to describe it. If you're unaware, if you haven't seen that bug, check out my Mushroom Kingdom Bright Bonnet build, where I literally have this happen in the later half of my gameplay. So that also creates the issue of not only can I only run, if I wanted to separate, even as a founder, if I wanted to separate between these two versions of the Warframe, I basically have to use Prime and Umbra as 2 separate distinct Warframes and then build accordingly, because there's sometimes a lot of options that you want to have that involve significant resource costs, like when you're potentially trying to use different Archon shards configuration, even to the extent of, well, if I don't want Warcry on a build variation subsumed over Radio Blind, I want to subsume it over Radio Javelin. Well, now you have to go and change that because there's no ability for you to do that on one copy of this Warframe and then another copy of this Warframe. So it's a unique issue to Excalibur that really shouldn't exist. And so with the problems, the fundamental problems that Excalibur Prime creates stated, what do I think is the best solution to this? And this really comes down to probably the easiest way to do this, which is simply buff Excalibur's base stats to match that of Excalibur Prime and Excalibur Umbra. Because this fixes 2 core issues, 2 of those core issues. It pretty much ignores the lack of the Sentience passive issue, so you can completely circumvent that. That basically would allow Umbra to exist as this novelty or this gimmick in a separate Warframe, and then allow you to be able to mirror base stat builds that are dependent on those base stats on Prime and Umbra without any limitation on base Excalibur. And then also it would fix the acquisition issue because you can make infinite versions of Excalibur. And what this would functionally do, we want to talk about functionally what this would create if Excalibur had the same base stats as Umbra and Prime. This would allow you to have multiple copies with different subsume slots with Archon shards, literally making Excalibur no different than any other Warframe's ability to have multiple variations with different configurations and easy acquisition of the best version of the Warframe. What this would do to Umbra is make him sort of this niche thing that exists as this cool gimmick, feature, whatever. And it would do, most importantly, I think, make Excalibur Prime the cosmetic sort of novelty that he should really be in this game. The only fundamental difference there, obviously, being the death or passive, but if you're making that argument, let's be honest, that's kind of ridiculous. So that's always been a ridiculous argument when it comes to the difference between Prime and and Umbra. If that ends up being the single advantage of having Excalibur Prime, then that would be wonderful. That would be very noteworthy of a dramatic improvement. If not, basically, I would say that would be the fundamental solution to this entire issue that's existed since the beginning of the game. One option, or one sort of, if Excalibur's base stats were buffed, one I think important thing that would probably have to happen is around Circuit. So, Circuit, you'd probably want to make Excalibur Umbra the separate things. So then, like a founder like me, I would have the option of getting Excalibur Umbra or Excalibur Prime as Circuit options. And then for non-founders, that would be, you could have Excalibur Umbra show up, or you could have Excalibur show up, sort of making Excalibur Umbra the separate Warframe to Excalibur and base and Excalibur Prime. I think that's the only thing that I've thought of out of the pretty deep amount of thought I've had on this topic. That's the only thing that I thought that I could think of that would be potentially a problem with that. So I think that's the best solution to this. So explaining where this is a limitation, I think the best way to show this is a couple of different build variations. So if you talk about this Shield Fallout build, this is almost exactly what I'm running on Prime. If I want to make this exactly what I'm running on Prime, it would be this. Base energy being this much lower is a significant issue if you're trying to use Violet Shards, which is entirely an option on this build. You could have 4 Violet Shards on this build, and you would be incapable of doing that without having to do what is a common problem on base Excalibur, which is eating an Archon Shard just to get his energy even close enough, talking about at least 500 in order to get Violet Shards to work. This build also has a limitation, which is if I'm stacking some health here, which sort of circumvents his like poor base health at 370, by getting your health up to 1570, Warcry does in fact give you an armor increase. So yeah, the difference in armor damage reduction isn't insignificant here, but it's also non-trivial. So that's a problem where in this build, if I was using Violet, these are from a test that I was running, which these don't work on Exalted Blade, best that I can tell from testing. If I was running full Violet Shards, I would simply be able to, I would be missing out on at least one in order to then get a blue Archon Shard or Azure Archon Shard in order to increase my max energy to above 500 to even make that work, while also getting less armor. Now, keep in mind this build, if I wanted to run this exact build to be able to mirror it on Prime, on Excalibur Umbra, you would be losing out on Prime Sure-Footed, which is a problem, or just the Exila slot in general, because you would be forced to use Warrior's Rest to not have this continuously get decasted every time you want to use Operator, which when you're running Eternal War, that's a massive issue, or just a massive issue with your energy economy. So then you could even argue that unless you're running that, and then you could also just simply run into the issue where your /dash and Warcry are just disabled for the rest of the mission, which is an entirely fundamentally game-breaking problem that does exist. So you simply can't mirror that. And then looking at another build, getting back into this, if you wanted to run persistence, note that when you run this on Prime, when you run this on Umbra, you're over 700 armor. So in this state, you wouldn't even be able to meet the minimum criteria to run persistence to be able to get your Exilis slot potentially free to run a subsume without it having decasted, regardless of what subsume you want to run. Some fundamental problems here. And that's where, like I said, I think the best solution overall is to simply just buff Excalibur's base stats. So give him the same armor, give him the same energy. And I really don't see any sort of canonical or potential issue with that. Like, you can make some potential lore arguments about Primed having usually higher base stats, but I think Excalibur is an obvious exception to this and needs to be an obvious exception to this so that this problem is just simply null and void at that point. With obviously the only limitation being he doesn't get the Death Ward passive, which I think a pretty obvious opinion about that already. So I think that covers a lot of the fundamental issues here that exist between Excalibur, Excalibur Umbra, and Excalibur Prime, and really, if you want to even simplify it, the problems that Excalibur Prime creates. Because if Excalibur Prime didn't exist, then it would just be, okay, do you need the higher base stats or not? No. And same with Excalibur Umbra. If Excalibur Umbra didn't exist, it would be just, are you able to use the Prime higher end version or not? It's like, when they added Excalibur Umbra, they probably made this problem worse, to put it simply, because now it's no longer just a base stat difference. There's also this variable of the Sentience passive, which gets into, I think, the next potential solution, because we're covering over all of the potential solutions to this problem that I have come up with, which is involving just fixing Excalibur Umbra. So there's a few ways that this can be done. So I'm not sure if there's a technical reason why this hasn't been done yet and why they chose to go with Warrior's Rest as really a band-aid solution to the problem, which is just adding a potential toggle to enable or disable his sentience. You think if this mod could be created and converted into a UI item with 0% strength, if this can be done through a mod, it could probably be done through a toggle. Whether that's a toggle here, toggle in the prior screen, I don't know. But it's a potential option. The other option that I've suggested is, well, why not just make Excalibur Umbra actually slightly better than Prime and base Excalibur by just giving him a second Exilis slot and making that sort of a core concept of Umbra Warframes, in that any future potential Umbra Warframe that would be added would get their own copy of Warrior's Rest. That would give him, in this case, if they didn't change this mod at all, that would give him an actual power advantage over Excalibur Prime. And then there you go. There's a null and void argument. When it comes to which version is better. They could also just simply fix the Umbra sentience issues, but as we're probably all aware, that is such a monumental task. I believe it was even Pablo who said this, that it's a monumental enough task to where it's just simply not worth it. The other obvious issue with this is that it doesn't fix one of the fundamental issues with Excalibur as a Warframe in whole, which is acquisition. So unless they fix this and then also make him something you can purchase copies from Samaris, then that'll always be an issue of the fact that you just can't buy multiple versions of this Warframe. So then they would have to do that. If they added any of this, they would still have to do that in order to fully close what I think is some of the fundamental core issues with Excalibur and Excalibur Prime almost exclusively. So the question might come up, why now? Like, why now make this such a core issue? I think if you look at the past history of Warframe, there's been a significant amount of buffs to Excalibur going all the way back to Veilbreaker. Since his initial nerf of his ridiculous Radio Javelin spam build, you think Veilbreaker was added, they dramatically buffed /dash and gave at least Radio Javelin some extra utility. by giving it guaranteed slash. But still, probably one of the first major major buffs that Excalibur got. And then working down the line, you have the addition of Warrior's Rest, which was a fundamentally game-changing thing for a lot of people that don't have Excalibur Prime, that want to be able to mimic some builds on him, but it still left a gap open because it really is a band-aid solution. Talking about before Tekrad Encore, there was the buff to Slash Dash, where Slash Dash before did not provide shield immunity, and now it does in 1999. Massive change. And then the most obvious, which is when I really started making content on YouTube because of the dramatic increase in build requests that I got on Excalibur, because everyone around me knew just kind of the nature of how I've always played Excalibur. And that was Tekrad Encore, which really put Excalibur into the S tier when it comes to Warframes, especially melee-only gameplay like I play. So that's kind of a why now. And I think the position I'm in, where I have a lot of experience with Excalibur and on multiple versions. So like Excalibur Prime being my most used, Umbra being like my third most used Warframe, and then I've even used enough of base Excalibur to really get a whole picture of this argument and of this problem, where I think I might be in a unique position to really explain this topic and provide, I think, the necessary backing to hopefully finally fixing this fundamental core issue. Even if that does come down to as simple as buffing base Excalibur to be just as viable as Excalibur Prime, practically speaking. So I think that's why now. Some of the problems I've run into is obviously there's a order of magnitude on impact to the community that exists. I've been trying to fix that. Part of that is official forum threads, which unfortunately, the last 3 that I've made, sort of not even talking about making Excalibur Prime obtainable again, but just simply fixing some of these core issues with Excalibur Umbra, or just even literally a thread talking about buffing Excalibur's base stats to match Umbra, where Excalibur Prime was not even mentioned in my thread, in my original post, and I try to keep it out of the out of any of the I tried as best as I can to keep it from not being a part of the discussion and the rest of the thread. Even that was taken down. So there's a core problem here that exists, which is potentially even getting Digital Extremes to like really understand this problem that I think I've been able to properly observe and understand, and I hope demonstrate in this video on the fundamental gap that still exists between Excalibur Prime and Excalibur Umbra, and then also, in this case, base Excalibur, that I think really does have a simple solution to it. And I don't understand where a lot of the feedback from the community, let's say potentially the people that don't agree with these ideas, I don't understand where that pushback comes from. You can make an argument that if base Excalibur had the same stats as Excalibur Prime, the most affected people would be Excalibur Prime mains, which I would think reasonably consider myself an Excalibur Prime main. And if I'm suggesting that base Excalibur should have the same exact base stats and basically no major functional difference, being the only difference between that being the Death Orb, and the cosmetic difference being the Excalibur Prime skin and helmet. If I'm making that argument, I think it's reasonable to say that no reasonable person would have a pushback to buffing base Excalibur, because I think, like I said, Excalibur is in this unique position where you can't get his Prime version, and the version that you do have available to him as a new player is not equal to his Prime version, that there's a fundamental gap between them. And then also there's a just large gap that exists between these 3 different versions of the Warframe where you just simply can't mirror Excalibur Prime's utility or build configuration without some sort of compromise on either of the resulting versions of him. So that's where I kind of ask, if you're someone that would like for this problem to be finally solved, this is going to involve the community, and it's going to involve, more than likely, as overwhelming enough pushback to DE that the 10-year support pack heirlooms for Frost and Mag got, that then caused them to revert this change of exclusivity. Now, I would highly recommend keeping the argument to my primary solution to this problem, which is buffing Excalibur's base stats, because unfortunately, the fact that Excalibur Umbra has not been fixed yet is probably an indication that it will never be fixed. And DE is very ravenous about squashing discussions about Excalibur Prime and obtainability, even from founders. Even if it's coming from a founder, that doesn't seem to matter. So that's where I think focusing in the energy on this conversation to something as simple as buffing Excalibur's base stats to be equal to Excalibur Prime and Umbra. You know, maybe they just buff them across the board. That would be nice. Like 500, 500, and like 400 armor. That'd be kind of nice. But focusing in that to then hopefully get the attention necessary to actually have this topic addressed by DE. Because I have still yet to get any sort of feedback from DE on even the forum threads that I've gotten taken down by one of their community, one of their moderators or whoever. I still haven't gotten any feedback from, in this case, the DE community on why this is being done, because I don't see how a topic asking for Excalibur's base stats to be buffed is in any way a problem on the official forums. But yet that still seems to occur. And I think that's been a dramatic limitation on the progress on this topic, including some of the reach, including potentially even just letting the developers know, like, hey, there are some fundamentally build limiting and build breaking issues that exist with Excalibur as a whole. And here's the solution to that. And I think probably the best solution for that. So if you have any comments, any questions about this, any sort of potential other solutions, let's just say, that are even simpler than just buffing base Excalibur, then feel free to comment below. If you do intend on making or assisting in the progress of this topic, I will continue to be pushing this topic, even to the point of if it's consequential to my account. I highly doubt that's the case, but it's something I feel very strongly about, and I am willing to take that to the logical extreme of that, if need be, including quitting Warframe if that's the case. So if you feel as strongly about that as I do, then I guess subscribe, and ideally, if I do post any content on this, I will make at least a post about it. If I make forum threads or anything like that, any sort of potential results that come from this video and my continuous push towards fixing this problem, then feel free to subscribe, and thanks for watching.